There are two kinds of lost. The first is navigational, a problem of coordinates, of distance, of time. Voyager knew that kind of lost intimately. For 4 years, Captain Catherine Janeway and her crew of Starfleet officers and former Maquis rebels had been stranded in the Delta Quadrant, 70,000 light-years from home, charting the unknown with equal measures of scientific discipline and stubborn hope. That kind of lost had a solution, even if the solution was decades away. It had a heading. It had a plan. The second kind of lost is different. It isn't about coordinates at all. It's about waking up one day and discovering that everything you knew, your civilization, your home, your understanding of what the universe is, has been taken from you. That kind of loss doesn't have a heading. It barely has a horizon. On stardate 51438.2, somewhere in the vast emptiness of the Delta Quadrant, both kinds of loss were about to collide. What makes this particular, what if, so compelling isn't that it's random. It's that it's inevitable in the way that only the best science fiction is inevitable. Two crews. Two ships. Two civilizations defined not by their power or their technology, but by their refusal to give up. Voyager was lost trying to get home through a galaxy that kept throwing horrors in her path. The Colonial fleet was lost because home no longer existed. Because the civilization that built Galactica had been reduced to 50,000 souls aboard a ragtag fleet of ships running on fumes and faith. Both crews understood displacement. Both understood moral compromise. Both understood what it costs to keep going when the math says you shouldn't. The logic isn't borrowed. The crossover earns its premise because these two stories were always asking the same question from opposite ends of the same dark hallway. How much of yourself can you sacrifice before survival stops being worth it? If you want to see more crossovers like this, two universes that were never supposed to meet, colliding in ways that actually make sense, hit that subscribe button and drop your dream crossover in the comments. Live long and prosper. It began, as so many anomalies did in the Delta Quadrant, with something that shouldn't have been there. Ensign Harry Kim was running a standard long-range sensor sweep from ops when the console chirped at him in a register it reserved for genuinely unusual readings, not the casual alert of an ion storm or a nebula density fluctuation, but the sharp, insistent tone that meant the computer doesn't have a category for this. He ran the sweep twice. Then a third time. Then he straightened in his chair and said, with the careful calm of someone who had learned that alarm rarely helped, "Captain? You need to see this." Janeway crossed from the command chair to ops in 4 steps. She looked at the display. She looked at Kim. She looked at the display again. The sensors were showing 47 distinct vessel contacts emerging from a collapsing subspace corridor approximately 340,000 kilometers off the port bow. Not a standard warp wake. Not a trans-warp conduit. Something the Federation's database, extensive as it was after 4 years of Delta Quadrant mapping, had no classification for. A folded spatial rupture that burned hot as a star going nova and then pinched itself closed like a wound trying to heal. The vessels coming through it were metallic, angular, clearly artificial, and entirely unlike anything in Voyager's records. No nacelles. No warp signatures. Drive systems that 7 of 9, materializing at the science station with the particular efficiency of someone who had decided her presence was required before being asked, identified as chemically accelerated kinetic propulsion combined with a spatial displacement drive of unrecognized design. Pre-warp? Janeway asked. The propulsion is pre-warp by Federation classification. 7 replied, her tone carrying the faint edge it always did when Federation classifications failed to capture complexity. However, the spatial displacement drive appears capable of jumps that rival low-yield transwarp in effective distance covered. They are not pre-warp in any meaningful strategic sense, Captain. Tuvok, at Tactical, had already completed his threat assessment. 47 vessels confirmed. One is significantly larger than the others, approximately 1,400 meters in length, heavily armed, with weapons signatures consistent with conventional ballistic and energy-based systems. The remaining vessels range from large transport configuration to small single-occupancy craft. Several are showing hull breaches. Structural integrity on at least 12 vessels is critically compromised. He paused. They have not powered weapons yet, B'Elanna Torres muttered from engineering, her voice carrying through the calm. Janeway stood very still for a moment, watching the view screen as the sensor returns resolved into visual. A fleet of ships unlike anything she'd ever seen, battered and scarred and somehow still moving, pouring out of a wound in space that was already closing behind them. Her first instinct, trained deep into her Starfleet bones, was scientific curiosity. Her second instinct, trained into her by 4 years of Delta Quadrant survival, was caution. Her third instinct, the one that made her who she was something quieter and more persistent than either. These people are in trouble. Hail them, she said. The signal went out across 17 frequencies, including several that Seven identified as theoretically compatible with unknown drive technology emission bands. For 11 seconds, nothing came back but static. Then the view screen shifted, and Catherine Janeway found herself looking at a man who had clearly not slept in days, whose eyes carried the specific exhausted weight of someone who had been making impossible decisions for so long that impossible had stopped feeling like a word with meaning. He stood on a bridge that was dimly lit and functional in the way that things are functional when aesthetics have been stripped away by necessity. Behind him, officers moved with the crisp economy of a crew that had learned to waste nothing, not fuel, not time, not motion. He looked at her the way people look at things they suspect might kill them. "I'm Captain Catherine Janeway of the Federation starship Voyager," she said, keeping her voice level and open. "We mean you no harm. Can you understand me?" The universal translator hummed its quiet miracle. The man on the screen said nothing for a long moment. Then, "How do I know you're not one of them?" Janeway held his gaze. "I don't know who them is," she said carefully. "But I'd like to find out. And I'd like to help if you'll let me." The man studied her with eyes that had stopped trusting easily a long time ago. "Admiral William Adama," he said finally. "Battlestar Galactica." He said the name of his ship the way people say the names of things they love and are terrified of losing. "And you've got about 4 minutes before I have to ask you to back your ship away from my fleet." Janeway didn't ask why. She had already seen what Tuvok was flagging silently at tactical. The subspace corridor behind the fleet, cooling and collapsing, was showing secondary energy signatures. Something else was preparing to come through. Something that hadn't finished chasing them yet. The secondary energy signatures resolved into contacts before the 4 minutes were up. Tuvok's voice carried the particular quality it adopted during genuine emergencies. Not louder, never louder, but somehow more precise, each word placed with the deliberate care of a surgeon working near something vital. 3 additional vessels emerging from the corridor's trailing edge. Configuration unknown. Significantly larger than the Colonial vessels. Energy output suggests weapons systems of considerable yield. A pause of perhaps half a second. They are powering weapons. On the view screen, Adama had already turned away from Janeway. She could hear him behind the open channel. Condition 1 throughout the ship, action stations. His voice dropping into the register of a man who had given that order so many times it had become something close to a reflex. The battered fleet that had emerged around Galactica began moving with a discipline that surprised her. Damaged as they were, leaking atmosphere from hull breaches, running on what her sensors suggested were critically depleted fuel reserves, they tightened formation with the practiced coherence of a military organization that had learned, at catastrophic cost, exactly what happened when formation broke. "Mr. Tuvok," Janeway said. "Shields at maximum. Weapons standing by." She kept her eyes on the 3 new vessels resolving on the viewscreen's tactical overlay. They were unlike the Colonial ships in every aesthetic particular, where Galactica and her fleet were angular and utilitarian, built from the visual language of naval warfare translated into space. These new arrivals were something else entirely. Organic curves. Asymmetrical. The sensor return had a quality that made Harry Kim frown and run his analysis twice, because the computer kept trying to classify the whole material as partially biological. Weapons ports that didn't look like weapons ports until they opened. "Base stars," Adama said through the open channel. The word landed with the weight of something that had haunted him for years. 3 of them. He looked back at Janeway, and for a moment something shifted behind his eyes. Not softness, not trust, but a reluctant recalculation. "Your shields. How strong are they?" "Strong enough," Janeway said. "The Cylons will adapt to whatever you're using. They always do." He said it not as a warning but as a statement of physical law, the way someone might tell you that water runs downhill. "How fast is your ship?" "Faster than anything you've encountered," she said, and meant it without arrogance. Adama looked at her for another moment. Then he said, to someone off-screen, "All Vipers stand by. Do not engage until I give the order." And then, to Janeway, with the tone of a man making a tactical decision rather than a personal one, "Then stay between my fleet and those base stars. If you can do that, we'll talk." Janeway turned to Tuvok. "You heard him." "Aye, Captain." Voyager moved. What happened in the next 11 minutes was something that the doctor would later describe, in the medical log he kept with the slightly theatrical thoroughness of someone who suspected history was watching, as the most kinetically chaotic sequence of events I have witnessed since the hydrogen hunting incident, and considerably more confusing from a tactical medicine standpoint. 7 of 9 characteristically would describe it in her own log as tactically suboptimal on multiple vectors but ultimately sufficient. Tom Paris, at the helm, would not describe it in any official log because he was too busy flying. The 3 Cylon base stars opened fire with a coordinated precision that immediately told Voyager's crew these were not simple automated weapons platforms. Raiders, small, crescent-shaped attack craft that moved with an agility that suggested either exceptional pilots, or no pilots at all, poured from the base stars in waves, splitting their attack vectors to simultaneously pressure Voyager's shields and chase the Colonial fleet's flanks. Janeway had faced Borg cubes. She had faced Species 8472. She understood, from the first exchange of fire, that the Cylons were something different from either. Not the overwhelming brute force assimilation of the Borg, not the pure biological fury of 8472, but something tactical and adaptive and patient in the way that only an intelligence that does not fear its own casualties can afford to be patient. Voyager's phasers carved through the first Raider wave with efficiency. The shields absorbed the base star energy weapon strikes. Similar in principle to directed energy, different enough in modulation that Tuvok was already working on a targeting solution that would give them an edge. Photon torpedoes detonated against the nearest base star's hull and did genuine damage. These were not Borg-adapted shields, and the Colonial War had apparently not produced weapons in the same yield category as Federation ordnance. But there were 3 of them. And they were learning. "Shield frequency rotation," 7 reported from the science station, her voice carrying the faint undertone of someone who recognizes a familiar pattern from an uncomfortable angle. "The Cylons are analyzing our shield modulation with each strike. They will achieve partial penetration within approximately 9 minutes if we do not alter our defensive approach. They adapt," Janeway said half to herself. "Yes," 7 said. "Though the mechanism appears to be distributed network processing rather than nanoprobe assimilation. The distinction is meaningful." A pause. "They are also transmitting on a frequency I cannot fully decode. Internally. Between the base stars and the Raiders. They're talking to each other," Harry said. "Constantly," 7 confirmed. From Galactica's flight deck, something extraordinary was happening. Vipers, single-pilot attack craft that were, by every Federation metric, primitive compared to a Starfleet shuttle, were launching in controlled bursts, their pilots flying with an aggression and precision that Tom Paris, despite himself, watched with professional admiration. They didn't try to match the Raiders technically. They flew smarter. They flew in patterns that accounted for their own ship's limitations and exploited the raiders' attack angles, cutting inside turn radii, using Galactica herself as a shield and an anvil simultaneously. It was old-fashioned dogfighting, translated into space, and it was genuinely effective in ways that pure technical superiority could not entirely neutralize. "They've done this before," Paris said quietly. "A lot. 40 years, Chukotay said from beside Janeway, his voice low. He had been reading the sensor analysis with the focused attention he brought to situations where understanding the enemy was the difference between a solution and a catastrophe. "Their database, what little we can parse, suggests this war has been running for decades." With a pause in the middle, he looked at Janeway. "They're not scared of the Cylons. They're just tired. The first base star broke off its attack vector at minute 7, trailing plasma from 2 direct photon torpedo impacts. The remaining 2 recalibrated, pulling their raiders back in a way that read less like retreat and more like reassessment, and held position at the edge of weapons range. Watching. Processing." Janeway held her position between them and the Colonial fleet. She did not lower her shields. The tactical silence lasted 40 seconds, which in a combat situation feels considerably longer. Then the Cylons jumped away. Not the subspace fold that had brought the Colonial fleet here, something different, faster, a spatial displacement that happened between one sensor reading and the next, leaving nothing behind but residual energy signatures and the particular quality of silence that follows violence. On the bridge of Voyager, everyone breathed. "Damage report," Janeway said. "Shields at 73%, Tuvok replied. "No hull breaches. Minor power fluctuations on decks 9 and 11. 2 crew members treated for minor injuries. The Colonial fleet," he paused, and for Tuvok, a pause meant something, "has lost 1 vessel. A civilian transport. Registry unknown. Approximately 1,200 life signs. Gone." Nobody said anything for a moment. Janeway looked at the viewscreen, where Galactica sat massive and damaged and still, her hull scored with new burns alongside old ones. She thought about 1,200 people. She thought about a fleet of 50,000 trying to survive in a quadrant they had never heard of, being hunted by an enemy that had just demonstrated it could find them anywhere. She opened the channel to Adama. "Admiral," she said, "I think it's time we talked. Not about tactics." She let a beat pass. "About what happens next." Adama's face on the viewscreen was unreadable in the way that faces are unreadable when the person wearing them has decided that readable is a luxury they cannot afford. "Send a shuttle," he said finally. 1. Your people come to us. Another pause. "And Captain, I'll want your word that it won't be a Cylon walking off that shuttle." Janeway held his gaze. "You have it." She closed the channel and turned to Chukotay. "Get Tuvok 7 and the doctor ready. We're going to Galactica." She moved toward the turbolift, then stopped. "And someone find me everything the computer can pull about a civilization called the 12 Colonies. I want to know who these people are before I sit across a table from them." Harry Kim was already searching. His console returned nothing. Not a single record. Not a mention in any database, Federation, Vulcan, Borg assimilated, or otherwise. Whoever these people were, they hadn't just come from far away. They had come from somewhere the universe had no record of at all. The shuttle Cochrane cleared Voyager's shuttle bay doors and crossed the 40,000 kilometers to Galactica in silence, which was unusual because the doctor rarely permitted silence when he was present. "I want to establish something before we board," he said, addressing no one in particular with the tone of someone who has decided that his concerns deserve a formal airing regardless of audience receptivity. "We are flying a Federation shuttlecraft toward an unknown military vessel crewed by people who have been at war for what appears to be the majority of their civilization's recent history, whose first instinct upon encountering us was to point weapons at us, and who have specifically requested assurance that we are not enemy infiltrators capable of perfectly mimicking human biology." He paused. I am technically not human. I want it noted that I find the irony of my position somewhat uncomfortable. Noted, Tuvok said, from the co-pilot's seat. I also want it noted that my mobile emitter has been behaving erratically since those vessels emerged from the subspace corridor. Some form of electromagnetic interference. If I flicker out at a critical moment during diplomatic proceedings, I want the record to reflect that it was not a malfunction of my own design. Also noted, Tuvok said. 7 of 9, seated behind them with a medical tricorder and a board-characteristic stillness that she had never entirely shed, said nothing. She was looking at the sensor readings she had pulled before they left Voyager, running calculations that she had not yet shared with anyone, because she had not yet decided what they meant or, more precisely, what they meant for her specifically. The biological anomalies she had flagged during the initial long-range scan of the Colonial survivors were not resolving themselves into comfortable explanations. They were becoming more interesting. She found, in the particular corner of herself that remained most thoroughly Borg, that interesting was not a feeling she entirely welcomed right now. Chukotay flew. Janeway sat in the co-pilot's seat and looked at Galactica growing in the viewport with the expression she wore when she was cataloging everything and committing none of her conclusions to language yet. The shuttle bay they were directed to was functional in the way that Galactica was entirely functional. Every surface doing exactly what it needed to do and nothing more, the aesthetic of a ship that had shed non-essential weight the way a long-distance runner sheds everything that isn't engine or will. Deck crew in orange suits watched their approach with expressions that ranged from professional wariness to something closer to raw bewilderment. Several of them, Janeway noticed, had hands near sidearms that they were making a visible effort not to draw. She stepped off the shuttle first. That was deliberate. The man who met them was not Adama. He was younger, built lean and tired, with the specific posture of someone whose rank had been earned in circumstances that left marks. Colonel Saul Tigh, executive officer, who looked at Janeway's Starfleet uniform with the flat assessment of someone who had learned that unfamiliar things were threats until proven otherwise. Beside him stood a woman in civilian clothes who carried herself with a quiet authority that read, to Janeway's practiced eye, as political rather than military. Someone accustomed to rooms where power was negotiated rather than commanded. She had sharp eyes and the controlled stillness of someone managing significant pain. Captain Janeway, the woman said, and her voice was measured and precise. I'm President Laura Roslin. This is Colonel Tigh. A beat. Thank you for what you did out there. We lost a ship, Tigh said flatly, as though he wanted to make sure that fact was in the room from the beginning. I know, Janeway said. I'm sorry. We couldn't get to them in time. She held his gaze. We will do better. Something shifted fractionally in Tigh's expression, not warmth, not trust, but a recalibration of some internal measurement he was taking of her. He said nothing, which Janeway recognized as a form of provisional acceptance from a man who expressed acceptance provisionally, and nothing else. They were taken through corridors that hummed and clanked with the particular music of a warship running hard, the sound of systems under strain, of people moving with purpose through spaces designed for function rather than comfort. Crew members stopped to look at them. Some looked curious. Some looked frightened. One young woman looked at 7 of 9 with an expression that lasted only a moment before she controlled it, but which 7 catalogued with the precision of someone who has learned that other people's reactions to her are data worth keeping. The Admiral's quarters were small. Adama stood when they entered, which Janeway noted as a courtesy he didn't have to extend and had chosen to. He looked better than he had on the view screen, not rested, that was too much to hope for, but composed in the way of someone who had found, through long practice, the still point inside the storm that was always around him. Captain? He gestured to chairs. Sit down. Please. They sat. Roslin took a position beside Adama that spoke to a partnership that had been tested and survived testing. Tigh stood near the door with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who preferred standing. I'll be direct, Janeway said, because she had decided on the shuttle that directness was the only currency these people would accept. We don't know who you are. Your civilization doesn't appear in any database we have access to, Federation or otherwise. That means you didn't come from this galaxy, or you came from a part of it so far removed from any explored space that there's been no contact. She paused. The corridor you came through, we've never seen anything like it. Our best analysis suggests it was a form of dimensional fold rather than a standard spatial anomaly. She let that sit for a moment. Which means you may not be from our universe at all. The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens when someone says aloud the thing that has been present in the room since the beginning but that everyone has been carefully not saying. Rosalind spoke first. Does that change what you're willing to do for us? Janeway looked at her steadily. No, she said. But it changes what we can promise. She leaned forward slightly. I can offer you medical assistance. Repair support, within the limits of what we can provide without compromising your vessel's systems. Food, our replicators can produce enough to address your most critical shortages. She paused. What I cannot offer you, immediately, is a way home. I don't know if the corridor that brought you here can be reopened. Our science officer is working on that question. 7, who had been sitting with the stillness of someone listening at multiple levels simultaneously, said, There is an 18% probability that a corridor of equivalent aperture could be generated using Voyager's deflector array in conjunction with Galactica's spatial displacement drive. The variables are significant. The energy costs would be considerable. And there are complicating factors that I have not yet fully assessed. What complicating factors? Adama asked. He looked at 7 with the direct attention of someone who asks questions because he wants answers, not because he is performing interest. 7 met his gaze with the equanimity she had developed for moments when the honest answer was not the comfortable one. When your fleet came through the corridor, she said, you did not come alone. The Cylon vessels followed you. They will have completed their own analysis of the corridor's location by now. She paused. They know where you are. They will return. And when they do, they will bring more than 3 base stars. Ty pushed off from the wall. How many more? Unknown. But the tactical logic is straightforward. 7's voice carried no particular emotion, which somehow made the words land harder. You are a contained target in an unfamiliar environment. From the Cylon perspective, this is an optimal moment for a decisive strike. The room absorbed this. Adama looked at Janeway. Can your ship fight off a full Cylon fleet? Janeway considered the honest answer, which was possibly, depending on numbers, depending on circumstances, depending on variables I don't have enough data to assess yet. She gave him the honest answer. Voyager is one ship. A very capable one. But one ship. She held his gaze. Which is why the conversation we need to have isn't just about the Cylons outside. It's about making sure that what's inside, both our ships, is secure before they come back. Adama's eyes sharpened. Meaning? Janeway kept her voice level and her gaze direct. Meaning your own people have told us that Cylons can look exactly like humans. That they've infiltrated colonial society before. She paused. Admiral, we just brought 50,000 people within transporter range of my ship. I need to know, how many Cylons came through that corridor with you? And how would we know? The silence this time was a different kind entirely. It was the kind that comes before a conversation that changes everything. The question didn't detonate the room so much as it pressurized it. Ty's jaw tightened in a way that suggested the question had found something personal before it found something tactical. Rosalind's eyes moved to Adama with the particular quality of a look shared between people who have already had the conversation being gestured at, and have not finished having it. Adama himself went very still. Not the stillness of a man caught off guard, but the stillness of a man who had been waiting for this specific question from the moment Janeway's shuttle touched down, and had spent that waiting time deciding how much truth he could afford. That's not a simple question, he said finally. I know, Janeway said. I'm asking it anyway. What followed was 20 minutes of the most careful conversation Janeway had conducted since negotiating passage through Kazon space in Voyager's first year. Except that the Kazon had been straightforwardly hostile, which was, in its way, easier. Adama laid out the architecture of the Cylon problem with the methodical precision of a man who had briefed this particular nightmare so many times that the words had worn smooth. 12 humanoid Cylon models, each duplicated across an unknown number of copies, biologically indistinguishable from humans by any standard colonial medical technology. They had lived among the colonies for years before the attack. They were living among the fleet now. The known models had been identified. Janeway noted the careful phrasing, known models. But identification required either voluntary disclosure or the kind of intimate knowledge that came from long exposure. There is, Rosalind said, with the measured precision of someone choosing each word like a tool selected for a specific task, an additional complexity. There always is, Chukotay said quietly enough that it wasn't quite an interruption. Rosalind looked at him with something that might, in better circumstances, have been a wry acknowledgement. Some members of our crew recently discovered that they themselves are Cylons. Previously unidentified models. They didn't know. They believed themselves to be human. She paused. They still do not fully understand what they are. The doctor, who had been sitting with the professional attentiveness of a physician cataloging symptoms, straightened almost imperceptibly. 7 of 9 did not move at all, which meant, for 7, that something had struck a chord she was actively managing. How many? Janeway asked. 4 that we know of, Adama said. Possibly more. And they're still aboard your ships. They're still part of my crew, Adama said, and the distinction in his phrasing was deliberate and absolute. They didn't choose what they are. They've bled for this fleet. Fought for it. He looked at Janeway steadily. Whatever they are biologically, they're my people. I won't have them handed over to anyone. Janeway held his gaze. She understood what he was telling her, and she understood why, and she found, examining her own response to it, that she respected it even as it complicated everything she needed to do next. She thought of 7 of 9, who had come back from the Borg collective carrying technology and instincts that Starfleet had found deeply uncomfortable. She thought of the years it had taken for her crew to stop seeing the Borg infrastructure beneath 7's humanity, and start seeing the human being inside it. She thought about how close that calculus had run, and how different things might have been if Janeway had made a different choice in those first weeks. I'm not asking you to hand anyone over, she said. I'm asking you to let my doctor and my science officer work with your medical staff on a way to identify Cylons, not to punish them, not to segregate them, but because if there are silent agents aboard your ships who don't know what they are, they may be transmitting your location without knowing they're doing it. Right now. To those base stars. The room processed this. 3 hours later, the doctor was in Galactica's sickbay, which he described in his personal log as functional, technically competent, and approximately 40 years behind current Federation medical practice, which is to say it reminds me of the emergency medical holographic development documents from the early 2340s, which I have read extensively and which were, if I am being candid, somewhat humbling. He had his mobile emitter, his tricorder, and the particular energy of a physician who has been given a diagnostic puzzle that genuinely interests him. He also had Dr. Cottle, Galactica's CMO, who smoked unfiltered cigarettes in a sick bay full of patients and looked at the doctor's holographic nature with the expression of a man who had stopped being surprised by the universe some years ago and had decided that this policy was still working for him. You're not real, Cottle said, not unkindly, watching the doctor move between biobeds with a grace made possible by the absence of physical fatigue. I am entirely real, the doctor replied, with the practiced dignity of someone who has refined this particular response through extensive use. I am merely non-corporeal when it is convenient, and entirely present when it is not. It is, frankly, an enviable arrangement. He paused to scan. This man has 3 cracked ribs that haven't been properly set. May I? Cottle gestured permission with his cigarette. The doctor worked. And as he worked, his tricorder was doing something secondary that he had discussed with Seven before leaving Voyager, a background biological scan, running quietly beneath the standard diagnostic frequencies, looking for the anomalies that Seven had flagged from long range. The specific protein folding patterns. The cellular architecture that was almost human and then, at a level below standard colonial medical scanning resolution, was something else. He found the first one in the 4th patient he treated. A young woman, dark-haired, perhaps 30 years old, with a shrapnel wound in her left shoulder that had been inadequately cleaned. She watched him work with the wary curiosity of someone who had decided the alien doctor was probably not an immediate threat and was reserving judgment on everything else. Her name, from the chart, was Specialist Tyrol. No, this was a different crew member. He checked twice. Ensign Diana Agos. Engineering Division. The cellular pattern was subtle. Extraordinarily subtle. He understood immediately why colonial medicine had missed it. But it was there, layered into the mitochondrial structure like a second signature written in a language that required knowing what you were looking for to read. He finished treating her shoulder. He said nothing. He moved to the next patient. But he kept the skin data, and his expression, for the remainder of his time in sickbay, carried the weight of someone holding information whose implications he had not yet fully mapped. Aboard Voyager, 7 of 9 had returned to the ship while the diplomatic discussions continued and was alone in astrometrics, which was where she went when she needed to think without the particular texture of human presence nearby. The large display showed the Delta Quadrant around them, the colonial fleet arranged in defensive formation off Voyager's port side, the residual energy signatures of the collapsed subspace corridor still faintly visible at bearing 227 Mark 14. She was looking at the Cylon-based star sensor data from the engagement. Specifically at the internal transmission frequency she had flagged during the battle. The constant communication between base stars and raiders that operated below standard colonial jamming frequencies. She had been analyzing the signal structure for 2 hours. It was not a language she could translate. But signal structure had its own grammar, independent of content, and what the grammar told her was making her sit very still in a way that had nothing to do with Borg conditioning. The transmission wasn't tactical. It wasn't coordination data. The pattern was too complex for coordination, too recursive for simple command and control architecture. It was experiential. The Cylons weren't just talking to each other during combat. They were feeling it together. Harry Kim's voice came over the comm before she could complete the next logical step of her analysis. 7. Long-range sensors are picking something up. You need to come back to the bridge. What is it? A brief pause that told her he was choosing his words. You know how we said the Cylons jumped away to reassess? Yes. They reassessed fast. Another pause. 7. I'm reading 14 base star signatures. Bearing 031 Mark 7. Range 2.3 light-years and closing. His voice carried the careful steadiness of someone who has decided that the time for alarm has passed and the time for clarity has arrived. They'll be in weapons range in 40 minutes. 7 was already moving. 14 base stars. 3 had tested Voyager's shields and adapted in 9 minutes. 14 would adapt in considerably less. And somewhere in the colonial fleet, possibly in multiple somewheres, Cylon biology was receiving that same transmission signal she had been analyzing. Receiving it and perhaps responding. She stepped into the turbolift and thought about consciousness distributed across a network. About individuality subsumed into a collective purpose. About what it felt like to be the receiver of a signal you didn't know you were built to receive. She thought about this with more personal familiarity than she would have preferred. 14 base stars changed the geometry of every conversation happening simultaneously across both fleets. Janeway received the alert from Voyager on her communicator mid-sentence. She had been explaining the Prime Directive to Roslin, who had been listening with the focused attention of someone filing information for later use rather than immediate application. And the shift in Janeway's expression told Adama, who had been watching her with the particular vigilance he applied to people he was deciding whether to trust, that whatever the message was, it had moved the timeline on everything. 40 minutes, she said, closing the communicator. She looked at Adama. 14 base stars. Ty said something under his breath that the universal translator rendered faithfully, and that the doctor, rejoining them from sickbay at that precise moment, noted he would not be including in his official log. Adama was already moving to his tactical station. We can't fight 14 base stars. Not in this condition. Not here. He pulled up his fleet status without looking away from Janeway. 8 of my ships are at less than 60% structural integrity. I have enough fuel for maybe 4 more jumps, and I don't know this space. I can't jump blind in a sector I have no charts for. We're not fighting 14 base stars, Janeway said. Not directly. She was already thinking 3 moves ahead, which was where she preferred to operate. We need a defensible position. Something that limits their approach vectors, gives Voyager's weapons a focused field, and buys us time. She looked at the star charts Adama had pulled up. Colonial navigation data that meant nothing in Delta Quadrant terms, and then pulled up her own on a separate display. There's a Class 7 nebula approximately 0.4 light-years from our current position. Sensor opaque, high EM interference, dense enough to disrupt Cylon sensor resolution. Your fleet can shelter inside it. And your ship? Roslin asked. Voyager guards the entrance. Janeway said it the way she said most things that were going to be difficult, simply, without dramatizing the difficulty. 1 ship in a choke point is considerably more effective than 1 ship in open space against 14 opponents. You'd be alone out there, Chakotay said. He was not objecting. He was making sure she had said it where everyone could hear it. We've been alone out here for 4 years, Janeway said. We know how. The next 31 minutes were the organized, controlled chaos that Voyager performed well, the crew moving through emergency protocols with the coherent efficiency of people who had run enough genuine crises to stop wasting energy on panic. Torres had shields reconfigured for rotating EM frequency modulation before Tuvok finished requesting it. Paris had the nebula approach plotted and was already threading the Colonial fleet's formation into a coherent transit line. Kim was running continuous long-range sweeps and feeding tactical data to both Voyager's bridge and Galactica simultaneously, a dual-channel operation he had jury-rigged in 20 minutes using a modified comm frequency that Colonial wireless systems could receive. 7 returned to the bridge and went directly to the science station without breaking stride. I have completed my analysis of the silent transmission signal from the first engagement, she said, addressing Janeway but pitching her voice for the bridge. The Cylons are not merely coordinating tactically through their network. They are sharing sensory experience in real time. Every raider, every base star drone, experiences the combat as a collective event. She brought the signal analysis up on the main viewer for 3 seconds. A cascade of recursive pattern data that resolved, if you knew what you were looking at, into something startlingly like a neural map. This has 2 implications. First, their adaptation rate is faster than I initially calculated, because learning achieved by any one unit is immediately distributed to all units. Second, she paused, and the pause was uncharacteristic enough to make Chakotay look at her directly. The humanoid Cylons aboard the Colonial fleet are almost certainly receiving a version of this signal. Attenuated by distance and biological substrate, but present. They may not be consciously aware of it. But their biology is listening. The bridge absorbed this. Can we block it? Janeway asked. Unknown. The signal operates across a frequency range that partially overlaps with standard biological neural EM emissions. Blocking it entirely would require generating a suppression field that might affect humanoid crew members aboard both ships indiscriminately. 7 met Janeway's eyes. I recommend against attempting suppression until I understand the signal architecture more fully. How long do you need? More time than we have before the base stars arrive. Then it goes on the list, Janeway said, which was what she said when a problem was real and important, and would have to wait its turn. She turned back to the view screen. Tom, how are we doing on the fleet transit? Last Colonial ship is entering the nebula in about 6 minutes, Paris reported. Galactica's holding at the threshold. Adama won't go in until the civilian ships are clear. Janeway had expected that. She met him at the nebula's edge, ship to ship, on the open channel that had become their working frequency. Galactica sat massive and scarred against the blue-white luminescence of the nebula's outer boundary, Vipers in close patrol formation around her flanks, and Janeway found herself thinking that there was something genuinely impressive about a ship that looked like that, battered to the edge of functionality, and still unmistakably, intractably present. Your people are inside, she told Adama. They're safe for now. The EM interference will mask their signatures completely. And you're staying out here. Someone has to. Adama was quiet for a moment. Then, I want to send Vipers to support your position. Admiral, I know what your sensors say about Viper technical capability relative to your own systems, he said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite irritation but was adjacent to it. The tone of a man who has had his tools underestimated before, and has developed a measured response to it. My pilots have been flying against Cylons their entire careers. They know things your sensors won't tell you. A pause. Let me send 20. They'll take orders from your bridge. Janeway looked at Chukotay, who gave her the fractional nod that meant tactically sound, I'd take it. She looked at Tuvok, who said, the additional attack vectors would complicate Cylon targeting solutions. It is not an inefficient arrangement. 20 Vipers, she said to Adama. And Admiral, when this is over, assuming there's an over, we need to finish the conversation we started about the Cylons in your fleet. I know, he said. He said it without evasion, which she was learning was how he said the things he wasn't happy about. We will. Galactica slid into the nebula like something vast and tired finally finding shelter, and Janeway watched her go with a feeling that was complicated and didn't fully resolve into any single word. The doctor had been quiet since returning from Galactica's sickbay, which was, for the doctor, a diagnostic sign in itself. He had submitted his medical report through standard channels and had not volunteered interpretation, which meant he was deciding something. Janeway found him in sickbay, standing at his console with the particular stillness of someone turning a problem over and over looking for the angle that made it workable. What did you find? She asked. She had read his report. She was asking about what wasn't in it. He turned to face her. The mobile emitter flickered once, the EM interference from the nearby nebula catching it, and for a half-second his image stuttered, which he had long since learned not to react to visibly. I found 3 individuals aboard Galactica with the biological marker pattern 7 flagged. Cellular architecture that matches the silent profile she identified from long-range scans. He paused. None of them know. I am virtually certain of that. The tells of conscious deception are absent, and I am, if I may say, a sophisticated diagnostician of deception. Another pause, smaller. One of them is quite young. A damage control specialist. She spent the battle we just fought in a compromised section of Galactica's hull, sealing a breach manually, in vacuum exposure for approximately 4 minutes. He looked at Janeway steadily. She nearly died protecting that ship. Not knowing what she is. Janeway was quiet for a moment. Does Adama know about these 3 specifically? I don't believe so. He knows there may be undiscovered Cylons in his fleet. He doesn't know I've found specific individuals. The doctor's voice carried the particular weight of someone sitting with information that has consequences in every direction. Captain, if I tell him, even with the best intentions, I cannot control what happens to those people. Military command under combat stress, with 14 base stars 40 minutes away, is not an environment that lends itself to nuanced responses to existential threat disclosures. And if you don't tell him, and one of them transmits something they don't know they're transmitting, Then people die who might not have died otherwise. He met her eyes. Yes. I have done the math. I find I don't enjoy it. Janeway stood in the quiet of sickbay and thought about a damage control specialist sealing a hull breach in vacuum. She thought about 7 of 9, 10 years ago, being cut out of a Borg exoskeleton on a table not unlike this one, carrying a collective inside her that she hadn't chosen and couldn't yet control. She thought about the Prime Directive, which she had broken and upheld and reinterpreted more times in the Delta Quadrant than she could count, and which always seemed to find new ways to be both absolutely clear and absolutely insufficient. Keep the data secure, she said finally. Don't delete it. We'll need it. She held his gaze. And start working on a way to tell those 3 people what they are before anyone else does. They deserve to hear it from someone who is going to treat them like patients, not suspects. The doctor nodded slowly. That, he said, is the first thing anyone has said today that feels unambiguously right. On the bridge, Harry Kim's voice came over the comm with the careful steadiness that meant the waiting was over. Captain, 14 base stars just dropped out of FTL. They're here. 14 base stars filled the long-range display like a sentence written in a language that only had one word. They came out of there faster-than-light jumps in a formation that was not random, spread across a 200,000-kilometer arc that bracketed the nebula's entrance with the geometric precision of something that had done tactical mathematics and arrived at conclusions. They had known, or calculated, where the Colonial fleet had gone. They had come to the right place. And they had brought enough firepower that the message embedded in their formation was not a threat so much as a statement of arithmetic. This ends here. Voyager sat at the nebula's mouth with 20 Vipers in loose escort formation, which was, by any objective measurement, a position that should have felt untenable. Janeway, on her bridge, found that it felt clarifying instead. This was a thing she had noticed about herself over 4 years of Delta Quadrant survival. That genuine extremity had a way of burning away the secondary considerations and leaving only the problem, clean and workable, like metal after a forge. Tuvok, she said. Targeting solutions computed for all 14 vessels. Torpedoes spread configured for maximum simultaneous engagement across the formation arc. A pause. I should note that engaging all 14 simultaneously is not tactically advisable. I know. We're not engaging all 14. She leaned forward slightly. We're making them come to us through a single point. How many can realistically press through the nebula entrance at once given the aperture geometry? Tuvok worked the calculation. Given the base star's apparent vessel dimensions, a maximum of 3 could engage simultaneously without mutual interference. More likely 2, given the silent preference for coordinated approach patterns we observed in the first engagement. So 14 becomes 2, Paris said from helm, with the tone of someone finding unexpected comfort in geometry. Temporarily, Seven said. They will attempt to widen the approach vector. The nebula's EM field will complicate but not prevent this. I estimate we have 40 minutes before they find an alternative entry point around the nebula's southern boundary. 40 minutes, Janeway said. Then we make the next 40 minutes count. The first 2 base stars entered the approach corridor with their raiders already deployed. A cloud of perhaps 300 crescent-shaped attack craft that swept ahead of the larger vessels like a wave preceding a tide. Voyager's phasers opened up in the precise, disciplined cadence that Tuvok preferred, targeting raiders in overlapping firing solutions that cleared approach vectors faster than the Cylon swarm could fill them. Photon torpedoes, fired in pairs, bracketed the lead base star's forward weapons arrays and detonated with the kind of violence that briefly made the viewscreen compensate for brightness. The Vipers entered the fight in the way that only pilots who have been doing something their whole lives enter a fight, not with the mechanical efficiency of programmed response, but with the fluid improvisational intelligence of people who have learned their craft so thoroughly that it has become instinct. 20 Viper pilots, call signs crackling across the wireless frequency that Kim had patched into the bridge audio, flew into the raider swarm and did something that Voyager's targeting systems alone could not do, they broke the Cylons formation logic from inside it. "Starbuck to Voyager Actual," came a voice over the comm, female, fast, with the specific cadence of someone who finds combat clarifying in the same way Janeway did. "You've got a flanking group of 60 raiders coming around your port nacelle. We're on them. Don't shoot our way." "Understood," Janeway said. "Tuvok port phaser array, focus fire on the base star's starboard weapons cluster." "Aye." The lead base star took 3 direct photon torpedo impacts in 90 seconds and broke off its approach, trailing plasma from 2 hull sections and with its forward radar coordination array visibly compromised. The second base star pressed forward, adapting its shield modulation. 7 tracked the adaptation in real time, feeding Tuvok new targeting frequencies every 40 seconds in a rhythm they had developed without discussing it, the particular shorthand of 2 people who trust each other's competence enough to stop explaining every step. It was working. It was working because the geometry was working, because Janeway had made the nebula mouth into a kill zone, because Viper pilots who had been fighting Cylons since before some of Voyager's crew were born knew things about Cylon attack patterns that no sensor sweep could capture. It was working because Voyager was, at her core, a very good ship crewed by very good people who had been forged into something exceptional by 4 years of exactly this kind of impossible situation. And then the Cylons changed the equation. "Captain?" Seven's voice carried the tone she reserved for information she had hoped would take longer to arrive. "The Cylon network transmission I identified earlier, the experiential signal, has increased significantly in amplitude. It is no longer attenuated." She looked up from her console. "Something aboard Galactica is broadcasting. Inside the nebula." The bridge went very still. "A Cylon," Chakotay said. "A Cylon who may not know they're doing it," Seven said. "The signal architecture suggests autonomic response rather than conscious transmission. But the effect is the same. The base stars are receiving positional data on the Colonial fleet through the nebula's EM interference. Which means the nebula isn't hiding them anymore," Paris said. "Not from the Cylons. No." Janeway made the decision in the time it takes to make decisions when there is genuinely no good option and several bad ones. "Get me Adama." The channel opened in 3 seconds. Adama's voice came back tight and controlled. "I'm here. We're seeing the Cylon formation shifting. They're moving to encircle the nebula." "I know. Admiral, there's a Cylon transmitter active inside your fleet. We believe it's involuntary. Someone who doesn't know what they're doing. We need to find them and suppress the signal." A silence that lasted exactly as long as it needed to for Adama to absorb the full meaning of what she had said. "You know who it is." It was not quite a question. Janeway looked at Chakotay. She looked at the view screen, where the Cylon formation was visibly reorienting, the geometric precision of their movement carrying the cold elegance of something that has received the information it was waiting for. She thought about a damage control specialist sealing a hull breach in vacuum. She thought about the doctor's voice saying she nearly died protecting that ship. "We have a medical hypothesis," she said carefully. "We need to come aboard to confirm it and to help. Not to take anyone into custody. Not to make determinations about anyone's status." She paused. "Admiral, we need you to trust us." Another silence. Outside, the battle continued. She could hear it in the background of Adama's channel, the distant percussion of Galactica's guns, the wireless chatter of pilots. When Adama spoke again, his voice had the quality of a man who has decided that the cost of distrust has become higher than the cost of its alternative. "Come aboard," he said. "Bring your doctor." 7 of 9 did not go with Janeway this time. She remained at the science station, tracking the Cylon formation's movement, running the signal analysis, doing 3 things simultaneously with the focused efficiency that she had once applied to the collective's tasks and had since redirected toward problems she had chosen herself. But part of her attention, the part she kept quietest, the part that she examined least often because examining it required acknowledging things she preferred to keep theoretical, was on the transmission signal itself. She had told the bridge it operated across frequencies that overlapped with biological neural EM emissions. She had not told the bridge that she had, in the last 20 minutes, begun to detect a faint resonance of that signal in her own cortical node monitoring data. Not the transmission itself. She was not a Cylon, and the distinction mattered. She was certain the distinction mattered, but something adjacent to it. A frequency that her Borg implants were receiving and her human biology was not filtering as cleanly as it should. She noted it. She filed it. She continued working. Outside, a Viper pilot whose call sign was Hello pulled his craft into a vertical split that took him directly through the center of a 12-raider formation and came out the other side with 3 kills and a story. And on the Voyager bridge, Harry Kim quietly noted that the Cylon formation had completed its encirclement of the nebula and that they were now, technically, surrounded. "Captain's going to want to know about this," he said to Chakotay. "She already knows," Chakotay said. He was watching the tactical display with the expression he wore when he was working out the next 3 moves. "She planned for it." Kim looked at the display. Then at Chakotay. "She planned for being surrounded by 14 base stars? She planned for needing a reason to do something dramatic," Chakotay said. "The surrounding is just the setup." He did not, entirely, look like he was joking. The shuttle ride back to Galactica was the fastest Chakotay had ever flown one, which was saying something given his history with fast shuttle rides and bad situations. Janeway sat in the co-pilot seat with the doctor beside her, and said almost nothing for the 4 minutes the transit took, which Chakotay recognized as her processing mode. The silence before the clarity, the stillness before the decision that everyone else would then have to move very quickly to keep up with. The doctor, for his part, was reviewing his medical data with the focused attention of someone rehearsing a difficult conversation, which it was. Outside the viewport, the Cylon formation had completed its geometry around the nebula with the patient thoroughness of something that had decided to be certain rather than fast. Raiders patrolled the perimeter in overlapping patrol patterns. The 14 base stars held position at distances that kept them outside Voyager's most effective torpedo range while maintaining weapons coverage on every exit vector. It was, Chakotay thought, a tactically elegant arrangement, and he did not enjoy admiring it. Galactica's shuttle bay received them without ceremony. Adama was waiting at the deck with Ty and a woman Chakotay hadn't seen in their earlier meeting. Tall, dark-haired, with the watchful stillness of someone whose job was to notice things other people missed. She was introduced as Sharon Agathon, call sign Athena, and she was introduced with a particular deliberateness that told Chakotay the introduction itself was a message Adama was telling them, before a word was spoken about the current crisis, that a known Cylon stood in his inner circle and was trusted there. It was, Chakotay thought, a more eloquent statement of position than anything Adama could have said aloud. They gathered in the Admiral's quarters again, tighter this time, the room carrying the particular compressed energy of too many people managing too much information in too little time. Rosalind was present, seated with the careful posture of someone managing physical discomfort through discipline. Ty stood. Sharon Agathon stood near the door with her arms at her sides and her expression professionally neutral in the way that people are professionally neutral when they know the conversation is partly about them. The doctor presented his findings without preamble, which was the right call. Preamble in this room, at this moment, would have been a form of condescension. 3 individuals. Biological markers consistent with the Cylon profile. No evidence of conscious awareness of their nature. The signal transmission appearing to originate from one of the 3, autonomically, in response to the Cylon network's increased broadcast amplitude when the base stars arrived. He showed them the data. He did not editorialize. He had decided correctly that the data was sufficiently extraordinary that editorializing would only make it harder to absorb. Ty looked at the names on the medical display for a long time. Something moved behind his eyes that was not surprise. Or rather, it was surprise compressed under a weight of other things that had no names yet. "Ensign Agos," he said. "She's in my damage control division." "Yes," the doctor said. She sealed a whole breach during the last engagement. Eva. 4 minutes in vacuum. Ty's voice carried no particular emotion, which was the way Ty's voice carried things that had a great deal of emotion in them. I know, the doctor said. I treated her afterward. Sharon Agathon said from near the door. Which model? She asked it with the directness of someone for whom the question was not theoretical. We don't know, the doctor said. The biological architecture matches the general Cylon profile you've described, but without a reference database for the specific models, I can't make a more precise identification. She may be a model none of you have encountered. She may be a variant. He paused. She is, in every behavioral and psychological metric I can assess, entirely herself. Whatever that means for her specifically. Sharon absorbed this. It means everything, she said quietly. It always means everything. Janeway had been listening. Now she spoke. We need to suppress the transmission signal. The Cylons are using it to track your fleet's position inside the nebula. Every minute we don't address it, their tactical picture improves. She looked at Adama. The doctor believes he can generate a localized EM suppression field tuned to the specific transmission frequency. It won't harm her. She won't feel it. But it needs to be deployed near her current position, and it needs to happen now. And then what? Rosalind asked. The question was not hostile. It was the question of someone who had learned to look past the immediate solution to the shape of what came after it. Then we talk to her, Janeway said. Before someone else does. Before she finds out from a rumor or a witch hunt, or a panicked crew member with a sidearm. She held Rosalind's gaze steadily. She deserves to hear the truth from people who aren't going to treat it as a verdict. Rosalind looked at Adama. The look between them was the kind that carries entire conversations in its negative space. Do it, Adama said. The EM suppression device was a piece of Voyager engineering modified in transit. Torres had built it in 23 minutes from components in the shuttle's emergency repair kit, guided by 7 specifications over a comm channel, and it was, Torres had noted with the professional satisfaction she permitted herself, elegant for something assembled under those conditions. The doctor deployed it in Galactica's engineering section, where Ensign Agos was currently running a power conduit diagnostic, by the simple method of placing it in a Jeffries tube access panel 12 meters from her position and activating it remotely. Seven's voice came over the comm 18 seconds later. Transmission signal suppressed. Silent network reception of positional data has ceased. A pause. The base star formation is recalibrating. They know they've lost the signal. They will accelerate their search for an alternative nebula entry point. How long? Janeway asked. 22 minutes. Perhaps less. 22 minutes. Janeway stood in Galactica's corridor and thought about what she needed to accomplish in 22 minutes and in what order. The tactical problem and the human problem were running on the same clock, and neither would wait for the other to resolve first, which was, she thought, a reasonably accurate description of command in general. Back on Voyager, 7 had been doing something she had told no one about, because she had not yet decided whether it was relevant or a personal matter, and the line between those two categories had been moving on her in uncomfortable ways for the past hour. She had isolated the frequency resonance in her cortical node data and run it against the silent transmission signal's full spectral profile. The overlap was 23.7%. Not enough to constitute reception in any meaningful sense. Not enough to suggest any functional connection between her Borg implants and the Cylon network. But enough that she had stopped being able to call it coincidence. She had also, in the past 30 minutes, been receiving something through the standard Voyager comm array that was not a standard transmission. Not directed at Voyager specifically, she had checked 3 times, with increasing care. But present in the background electromagnetic environment of the space around them, layered beneath the silent tactical frequencies in a bandwidth that required Borg-enhanced processing to isolate. A signal within a signal. A pattern within a pattern. She had been trying to decode it for 20 minutes when she realized that decoding was the wrong approach. It wasn't encrypted. It wasn't a message in any conventional sense. It was a question. The same question, repeated with the patient persistence of something that had been asking it for a very long time, and had learned that patience was more reliable than urgency. Are you one of us? Seven sat with that for a long moment. Then she opened a channel to the bridge. Mr. Kim, she said, keeping her voice entirely level. I need you to locate Commander Chukate's position aboard Galactica and patch me through to him directly. Tell him I need 5 minutes. Tell him. She paused, choosing the precise words. Tell him I've found something in the silent signal that we may have fundamentally misunderstood. Kim's voice came back carefully. Understood. Should I tell the captain? Seven looked at her console. At the question repeating itself in the background radiation of a battle they were losing on points. At the 23.7% overlap in her own neuromonitoring data. Yes, she said. Tell the captain as well. She closed the channel and looked at the signal. The signal looked back at her, patient and recursive, asking its question into the dark. Whether she had an answer was something she had not yet determined. Whether the answer mattered more than she wanted it to was something she suspected she already knew. The Cylon Hybrid spoke in the language of everything happening at once. This was what the away team found when Voyager's plan pivoted, as Janeway's plans had a habit of doing, from its intended trajectory into something stranger and more necessary. The captured base star had been the third to engage Voyager in the initial battle, the one that had taken 2 direct torpedo impacts to its forward coordination array and had subsequently drifted rather than jumped, its propulsion systems compromised in ways its automated repair functions hadn't fully addressed. It sat at the nebula's edge like a wounded animal that hadn't decided yet whether to flee or fight, and when Seven identified it as structurally intact enough to board, Janeway had made a decision that Chukate had questioned once, quietly, and then stopped questioning because her reasoning was sound. If the Cylons were asking "Are you one of us?" through their background signal, the place to find out what that question meant was at its source. The boarding party was small by necessity and composition by design. Seven, because she had heard the question. Tuvok, because someone needed to be thinking purely tactically. And Sharon Agathon, who had volunteered before she was asked, because she knew things about Cylon architecture that no sensor sweep could replace. Adama had agreed to her going with the expression of a man who had learned that the people he trusted most were often the ones who put themselves in the most dangerous positions, and that fighting this fact was less productive than accepting it. They crossed in environmental suits through a docking collar that Torres had jury-rigged in 14 minutes, which Torres considered adequate and Tuvok considered sufficient, and Seven considered irrelevant because the question of whether they could get in was less interesting than the question of what they would find inside. A Cylon base star, from the inside, was nothing like anything in the Federation's design vocabulary. It was organic in a way that went beyond aesthetics. The corridor walls carried a faint luminescence that pulsed in irregular rhythms, not mechanical cycling but something closer to respiration. The structural material was partly biological, as Voyager's sensors had suggested, but experiencing it in person rather than through sensor data carried a qualitative difference that Seven found herself registering in ways she couldn't entirely attribute to tactical assessment. It felt, in a word she examined and kept, alive, not metaphorically but literally, in the way that a body is alive rather than the way a machine is alive. Centurion patrol patterns, Sharon said quietly, moving through the corridor with the ease of someone reading a building's layout from memory. 2-unit sweeps, 12-minute intervals. We have 9 minutes before the next pass. She looked at Seven. The hybrid chamber is at the ship's core. It's always at the core. You've been inside a base star before, Tuvok observed. I was built inside one, Sharon said, with the flat matter-of-factness of someone who had spent considerable time arriving at a relationship with that sentence that allowed them to say it without stopping. Different model. Same basic architecture. She moved forward. This way. The hybrid chamber was a pool. That was the only word that fit, though it was inadequate in the same way that calling a warp core a container was inadequate. A rectangular depression in the base star's central chamber, filled with a fluid that carried the same bioluminescent quality as the corridor walls, and in it a figure, humanoid in basic configuration, connected to the ship's systems through organic filaments that entered its body at multiple points along its spine and skull, its eyes open and moving rapidly across a visual field that none of them could see. It was speaking continuously, in the overlapping recursive patterns that Seven had identified in the transmission signal, not words in any conventional sense but a constant stream of processed experience, the ship's systems and the hybrid's consciousness woven together into something that was neither entirely one nor entirely the other. Seven stood at the chamber's edge and listened. Not with her ears. With the 23.7%. She had not told Tuvok about the 23.7%. She had told Chakotay, who had told Janeway, who had said keep monitoring it and tell me the moment it changes. It had changed 3 times since she boarded the base star, each time incrementally, each time in the direction of greater resonance. She was receiving the hybrid's transmission more clearly with every meter closer she had come, and the clarity was not comfortable in the way that clarity sometimes isn't comfortable. It was the clarity of a door opening onto a room you'd suspected was there, and had been hoping wasn't. She crouched at the pool's edge. The hybrid's rapid eye movement paused, fractionally, and its stream of processed language shifted register in a way that Sharon noticed. "It knows you're here," Sharon said quietly. "I know," Seven said. "Not just that someone is here. It knows you're here." Sharon looked at her with the careful attention of someone connecting things. "What are you?" "I am human," Seven said, and the sentence was true and insufficient in equal measure, the way it had been true and insufficient since the day she came off that biobed. "I am also," she paused, finding the word, "augmented by technology that may share certain architectural principles with Cylon systems. The commonality is—" She stopped. The hybrid had turned its face toward her. Its eyes, which had been moving through invisible data, were still. It spoke directly to her, and what it said was not in the stream of consciousness recursive pattern it had been using before. It spoke in clear, deliberate words that the universal translator rendered without difficulty, which meant it had adjusted its language for her specifically, which meant it had been processing her presence in ways that went considerably beyond a proximity alert. "You were unmade," it said. "And made again. As we were. As we are. The question was not are you one of us? The question was do you know what you are?" Seven was silent for 3 seconds, which was, for her, a long time. "I know what I am," she said. "You know what you were told," the hybrid said. "The collective unmade you. The humans remade you. What remains of the original is the question neither of them answered." Its eyes moved briefly to Sharon, and something in its expression shifted with a gentleness that Seven had not expected from something that looked like it did. "She knows. She has chosen. The choice is what makes the difference. Not the architecture," Sharon said very quietly. "It's right." "I know," Seven said again. She looked at the hybrid for a long moment. Then she said, "The signal you're broadcasting, the question you're asking through the background radiation. What happens when someone answers it?" The hybrid's expression was somehow patient. "We listen," it said. "We have always listened. The Cylons were made by humans. The question of what we are has never had a single answer. We ask it because the asking is honest. We asked it." It paused, and the pause had the quality of something very old choosing words with very young care. "Because we want to know if anyone else is asking it too." Tuvok, who had been monitoring the corridor for Centurion patrols with the disciplined attention of someone who had decided that the philosophical conversation was the other's domain, said from the chamber entrance, "We have 4 minutes before the next patrol." And 7, Voyager is hailing. Something has changed outside. 7 stood. She looked at the hybrid one more time. "I will consider what you've said," she said. "You already are." the hybrid said, and returned to its recursive stream, the ship's consciousness washing back through it like water finding its level. What had changed outside was the resurrection ship. It had jumped in 3 minutes ago, holding position behind the main base star formation at a distance that kept it out of any engagement envelope. A long, asymmetrical vessel that 7 sensor analysis, relayed from Voyager through the comm system, identified as the facility through which Cylon consciousness transferred at the moment of death. The mechanism by which Cylons cheated mortality. The thing that made them, in a tactical sense, inexhaustible. Every Raider pilot who died simply woke up somewhere else and went back. Janeway's voice came through the comm with the quality it had when she was holding several large thoughts in careful balance. 7. I need you back aboard Voyager. We have a decision to make that can't wait, and I need you in the room when we make it. A pause. All of you. Sharon too, if she's willing. 7 looked at Tuvok. Tuvok looked at his patrol timer. 2 minutes 40 seconds, he said. Then we move now, 7 said. As they moved through the base star's organic corridors toward the docking collar, 7 ran the hybrid's words through the part of her processing that she kept most honest with herself. The question of what we are has never had a single answer. She had spent 6 years building an answer to that question, constructing it carefully from the materials of her reclaimed humanity and her irreducible Borg past, and she had believed, most of the time, that the construction was complete. The hybrid had suggested, with the particular gentleness of something that didn't need to be unkind to be devastating, that the question didn't stop being asked just because you drafted an answer. She filed this. She kept moving. Behind them, in its pool, the hybrid resumed its conversation with everything happening at once, and somewhere in the frequency spectrum between its words and the background radiation of the universe, the question continued its patient transmission. Asking. Listening. Waiting. The resurrection ship changed everything, the way that single facts sometimes do, not by adding complexity, but by forcing a simplification that felt worse than the complexity it replaced. Janeway had called the senior staff to the briefing room and had also, in a decision that she made quickly and did not second-guess, invited Adama and Rosalind aboard Voyager. This was the first time either of them had been on the ship, and she watched them register it with the peripheral attention she gave to things that mattered but couldn't be the primary focus right now. Rosalind's eyes moving across the clean lines and functional elegance of the corridor with the expression of someone recalibrating something, Adama touching nothing, looking at everything, his face giving away less than it knew. She gave them 30 seconds to absorb Voyager before she took them into the briefing room and put the tactical situation on the table. The resurrection ship, she said, bringing it up on the wall display, is approximately 2,200 meters in length, holding position at bearing 114 Mark 22, approximately 800,000 kilometers behind the main base star formation. Our sensors confirm it is the facility through which Cylon consciousness is transferred at death. She let that sit for a moment. As long as it's in range, every Cylon casualty we inflict is temporary. Every Raider pilot who dies wakes up somewhere else and comes back. Every drone, every automated system, the collective learns from each death and redistributes that learning immediately. She looked around the table. We cannot win a war of attrition against an enemy that doesn't have attrition. Torres leaned forward. We could destroy it. The words landed in the room with the particular weight of words that are technically straightforward and morally enormous. Yes, Janeway said. We could. What followed was 40 minutes of the most difficult conversation Janeway had conducted in 4 years of Delta Quadrant command, and the difficulty had a specific texture. It wasn't the difficulty of unclear thinking or insufficient information, but the difficulty of everyone in the room thinking very clearly about something that had no clean answer. Torres made the case for destruction with the direct pragmatism that was her default mode in tactical situations. The resurrection ship was a weapons system. It was actively being used against them. Destroying it was no different from destroying a weapons depot. It reduced the enemy's capacity to make war. Every day it existed, more people died. The math was simple. Chukotay made the case against with the moral philosophy that was his default mode in the same situations. The Cylons aboard those base stars were conscious entities. Destroying the resurrection ship did not kill them. Death in this battle would, but it eliminated their ability to continue existing after death. It was not execution, technically, but it was the permanent removal of something that functioned as the difference between finite and infinite loss. It was deciding for conscious beings that their existence was a tactical inconvenience to be eliminated. Seven said, with the careful precision of someone who had spent 40 minutes with a hybrid and was not yet finished processing it. The Cylons did not choose to be built as weapons. They did not choose to be given consciousness. They asked through their signal whether anyone else was asking the question of what they are. Destroying the resurrection ship does not answer that question. It ends the conversation. Sharon Agathon said nothing for a long moment, and then said quietly, "Every Cylon who dies in this battle thinks their consciousness transfers to that ship. They believe they will wake up. If you destroy it." She stopped, finding the words. "They will die believing something that isn't true anymore. Not knowing what you took from them." She looked at Janeway. "That matters. I don't know if it changes the tactical decision, but it matters." Adama had been listening with the focused stillness of a man who had sat with this question before, in different forms. "We've had the chance to destroy resurrection technology before," he said. "We took it. And I've never been entirely certain it was right." He looked at Janeway. "I'm not telling you what to decide. I'm telling you that the decision will follow you." Rosalind said, "The Cylons committed genocide. They killed billions of people. They are actively trying to complete that work right now, in this battle, against my fleet." Her voice was level and contained and carried the specific weight of someone who has earned the right to say what she is saying. "I understand the moral complexity. I am asking you not to let it become paralysis." Janeway sat with all of it. With Torres's math and Chukotay's philosophy and Seven's question and Sharon's grief and Adama's experience and Rosalind's history. She sat with it the way she sat with things that had no clean answer, not trying to resolve the tension but trying to find the action that she could defend to herself at 3 in the morning, 20 years from now, in the dark. She thought about the Prime Directive, which she had been thinking about since the moment the Colonial fleet came through that corridor. The Prime Directive said, "Do not interfere with the natural development of other civilizations." She had bent it, broken it, reinterpreted it so many times in the Delta Quadrant that she had stopped pretending it was a simple rule and had started treating it as what it actually was. A reminder that the consequences of intervention extend beyond the moment of the decision. The resurrection ship was not a Federation matter. It was not her civilization's conflict. These were not her people's deaths. Except that they were, now, because she had flown Voyager between Galactica and those base stars and she had made them her people in the moment she decided to help them, and you didn't get to unmake that choice because the next choice got harder. "Here's what we're not going to do," she said finally. "We're not going to destroy the resurrection ship without warning. We're not going to make that decision for conscious beings without giving them the opportunity to make a different choice first." She looked at the display. "We're going to hail the base stars. We're going to tell them what we intend to do and why, and we're going to give them 60 seconds to stand down." Torres looked like she wanted to object. She didn't, which meant she had thought it through and understood the reasoning even if she disagreed with the timeline. "And if they don't stand down?" Chukotay asked. Janeway met his eyes. "Then we do what we have to do to protect 50,000 people, and we live with it." The hail went out on every Cylon frequency 7 had identified, in clear language that the Universal Translator sent simultaneously in Colonial wireless encoding. Janeway stood at the view screen and addressed 14 base stars and whatever consciousness they constituted with the same directness she would have brought to addressing the Borg Queen or Q or any other entity that needed to hear exactly what was in front of it. She told them what she knew, about the signal, about the hybrid, about the question being asked. She told them that she had no interest in their annihilation. She told them that the fleet they were pursuing had nowhere left to run, and that she intended to make sure they had somewhere to go. She told them that the resurrection ship would survive this battle if they chose to end it, and that it would not survive if they chose to continue. 60 seconds. 48 seconds of silence. Then the raiders began to withdraw. Not all of them. Not immediately. But the nearest base star pulled its radar screen back in the specific pattern that Sharon identified, with visible relief, as disengagement protocol rather than tactical repositioning. A second base star followed. The formation, which had been the cold geometric expression of overwhelming force, began to lose its coherence. Not fleeing but pausing, which was different enough to matter. On the 12th second after the withdrawal began, one base star did not pull back. It powered its weapons arrays and began an attack run directly at Voyager. Tuvok said. "Captain?" "I see it," Janeway said. "Evasive pattern Delta. Torpedoes full spread." What happened in the next 90 seconds was the kind of combat that happens when one party has decided the conversation is over, and the other party has decided that a decision made is a decision kept. Voyager took 2 direct base star weapon hits, the second one hard enough to knock Torres off her feet in engineering and bring secondary EPS conduits down on decks 4 through 7. The base star took 4 photon torpedoes in its primary power matrix and a continuous phaser strike to its weapon systems that Tuvok delivered with the precise economy of someone who has very clear ideas about exactly how much force the situation requires. The base star went dark. Not destroyed. Janeway had been specific about that in her targeting instructions, and Tuvok, who understood the difference between a command and a suggestion, had delivered exactly what was asked. But disabled, drifting, its weapon systems offline and its movement capability reduced to minimal thruster authority. The remaining 12 base stars completed their withdrawal. The resurrection ship jumped away before Voyager's targeting systems could have reached it anyway, which Janeway thought was probably the most honest outcome available, the Cylons making a choice that preserved something they valued, which was not nothing. The battle ended the way battles end when either side has won completely, in a silence that carries all the weight of what just happened and none of the clarity of resolution. Harry Kim's voice came over the comm with the quiet of someone reporting something he isn't sure how to feel about. "Captain? Long-range sensors show the Cylon formation jumping away. All of them." A pause. "They're gone." Voyager's bridge breathed. In the nebula, 50,000 people who did not yet know what had just happened on their behalf continued doing the things that 50,000 people do when they are trying to survive: eating, sleeping, repairing, hoping. Ensign Diana Agos ran a power conduit diagnostic in Galactica's engineering section and did not know that a conversation had been held about her, or that a woman she had never met had argued that she deserved to hear the truth from someone who would treat it as information rather than verdict. She would find out. Not today, but soon. Some truths have their own timing, and the kindest thing you can do is make sure the timing is chosen rather than forced. 7 of 9 stood at her console and looked at the frequency where the hybrid's question had been. The signal was gone. The base stars had taken it with them when they jumped. But the 23.7% resonance in her cortical node data remained, quiet and present, not asking anything, simply being what it was. She considered it. She did not file it away this time. She let it stay where it was, in the part of herself that she examined most honestly, and she sat with it the way you sit with questions that have earned the right to remain questions. 3 days after the battle, the Delta Quadrant did what it always did. It kept going, indifferent to the significance of what had happened in it, the stars burning at their own pace and the distance home remaining exactly as vast as it had always been. Voyager held position at the nebula's edge while Torres and a team of Colonial engineers worked on something that had no official designation yet because naming it would have required agreeing on what it was. The technical problem was elegant in its difficulty. Using Voyager's deflector array in conjunction with Galactica's FTL drive to generate a spatial fold large enough for the Colonial fleet to transit back to their own universe, assuming their own universe was still accessible through the same dimensional seam they had fallen through, assuming the seam could be located, assuming the energy requirements were within the range of what both ships together could produce without leaving either of them dead in space afterward. 7 had calculated the probability at 18.7% and had not revised it upward, which Torres had told her was unhelpful and 7 had told Torres was accurate, and they had been working together in productive disagreement ever since. The 3 days had been full in the way that days are full when large things are happening beneath the surface of practical tasks. Janeway had told Ensign Diana Agos what she was on the morning of the second day, in Galactica's sickbay, with the doctor present and Sharon Agathon present at Agos' own request. She had asked, when informed that someone from Voyager needed to speak with her privately, whether she could have someone she trusted nearby, and Sharon had come without being told what the conversation would be about, which said something about the kind of person Sharon was. The doctor had delivered the information with the gentleness of someone who had thought carefully about every word and the clinical precision of someone who understood that clinical precision, in this case, was a form of respect, treating her as someone capable of receiving facts rather than someone who needed to be protected from them. He had shown her the scans. He had explained what the biological markers indicated and what they did not indicate. He had sat with the silence afterward without trying to fill it. Agos had been quiet for a long time. Then she had asked practically whether it changed her ability to do her job. The doctor had told her no. She had asked whether it meant she was transmitting information she didn't know she was transmitting. He had told her the suppression device addressed that, and that he could provide her with a personal version. She had asked whether Admiral Adama knew. He had told her yes. She had been quiet again. Then she had looked at Sharon with something that was not quite a question and not quite a statement, but existed in the space between them, and Sharon had said, simply, "It doesn't tell you who you are. It's just part of what you're made of." A pause. "The rest is still yours." Agos had nodded slowly, the nod of someone taking in something too large to process quickly and deciding to carry it rather than put it down. She had gone back to her duty shift 4 hours later. Ty had noted, in the clipped way Ty noted things, that her work was as good as it had ever been. The other 2 individuals the doctor had identified had been informed with the same care over the following day. Their responses were different in their particulars and similar in their essence. The specific shock of finding out something fundamental about yourself that you didn't choose, followed by the long, slow work of deciding what it means, which was work that would take considerably longer than 3 days and would need to be done somewhere safer than the current situation permitted. Adama had spoken to all 3 of them personally. He had not done it because protocol required it. He had done it because he was that kind of commander, which was the reason his fleet had followed him this far. The conversation between 7 of 9 and the hybrid had been written into a report that 7 filed with Janeway on the evening of the first day. The report was precise and comprehensive and in several places departed from 7's characteristic clinical detachment in ways that Janeway read carefully without commenting on. 7 had noted the 23.7% resonance in her cortical node data. She had noted the hybrid's specific statements about unmade and remade consciousness. She had noted, in the final paragraph, that she did not believe the Cylon signal represented a threat to her functioning or to Voyager's security, and that she intended to continue examining the resonance data in her own time. Janeway had read this paragraph twice. Then she had gone to find 7 in astrometrics, because some conversations belong in person rather than in reports. She had found 7 standing at the large display with the particular quality of stillness that meant she was thinking rather than working, which was a distinction 7 had learned to make, and which Janeway had learned to recognize. "How are you?" Janeway had asked. 7 had considered the question with the seriousness she brought to things she had learned deserved seriousness. "I am uncertain," she had said. "The hybrid suggested that the question of what I am has not been fully answered. I have believed, for some time, that it had been." She had looked at the star display. "I find that I am not distressed by the uncertainty. I find that I am, interested. Janeway had stood beside her for a moment. "That sounds right to me," she had said. "Does it? Certainty about who you are is usually borrowed from somewhere. The real version gets rebuilt every day." Janeway had looked at the display alongside her. "The question doesn't stop being worth asking just because you've answered it before." Seven had been quiet for a moment. "The hybrid said something similar?" "Then the hybrid was right," Janeway had said. "It happens." On the morning of the third day, Torres came to the bridge with the expression she wore when the math had resolved into something workable. She stood at the engineering station and pulled up a technical display that Seven refined in real time as Torres spoke, the two of them moving through the specifications with the fluid efficiency of people who had disagreed their way to a working solution. The spatial fold was possible. The energy requirements were at the edge of what Voyager's deflector could generate in conjunction with Galactica's FTL drive, but Torres had found a way to stage the output across 3 sequential pulses rather than one simultaneous burst, which reduced the peak energy demand to within sustainable parameters. The fold would hold for approximately 11 minutes. Long enough for the Colonial fleet to transit at maximum FTL jump capacity if they went in formation, in groups, sequenced to a precise schedule that Kim and Starbuck had spent the previous night working out together over a shared frequency, and what Janeway gathered had been a considerable quantity of something the Colonial fleet distilled in circumstances that did not invite inquiry. "The corridor won't take us back to where we came from exactly," Torres said, with the precision of someone who has learned that exactly is a word to be used carefully around physicists. "The dimensional seam has drifted. You'd come out somewhere in your home universe, but the coordinates relative to your own space are uncertain. We'd be putting you back in the right reality. Not necessarily on your doorstep." Adama, present on Voyager's bridge for the briefing, received this with the equanimity of a man for whom not on your doorstep was a significant improvement on any alternative currently available. "We've been navigating uncertain coordinates for 2 years," he said. "We know how. There's a secondary issue," Seven said. "The dimensional fold, once closed, cannot be reopened from either side with available technology. The transit is one-directional and final." She looked at Janeway, then at Adama. "Once the Colonial fleet goes through, contact between our universes ends. Permanently, by any practical definition." The room sat with this. Rosalind said, "Then we should use the time we have left well." They used it. The medical exchange happened in both directions. The doctor uploading everything he had learned about colonial biology into Galactica's medical database, Caudle sharing colonial pharmacological knowledge that the doctor described, in his log, as rudimentary in several areas and surprisingly sophisticated in others, particularly regarding trauma management, which makes a grim kind of sense given their circumstances. Torres and the Colonial engineering teams exchange technical documentation in the specific way of engineers who have found each other's solutions interesting, not copying, but noting, the way you note a different approach to a problem you've been solving the same way for years. Kim and Starbuck had a conversation about piloting that lasted 6 hours and covered, by Kim's subsequent account, everything from atmospheric flight physics to the specific question of whether instinct or calculation was more reliable under fire. A question they had not resolved but had enjoyed not resolving. Tuvok and Adama sat together for 2 hours in a room without many words, which was, for both of them, a form of communication. Chukotay spoke with Rosalind about what it meant to lead people through the loss of everything familiar, a conversation that neither of them had planned and both of them had needed. Seven returned to the base star one more time, alone, with Janeway's permission and Tuvok's profound reservations. The hybrid was where she had left it. She did not ask it questions. She sat at the pool's edge for 40 minutes and let the recursive language wash over her without trying to decode it, and when she left she felt something that she identified, after consideration, as clarity, not the clarity of answers but the clarity of having been honest with herself about the questions. The transit began at 0600 on the 4th day. Janeway stood on Voyager's bridge and watched the deflector array charge to levels that made the deck plates hum in a register she could feel in her sternum. Torres counted down from the engineering station. 7 monitored the fold's formation with the precise attention of someone who has staked a significant calculation on an 18.7% probability coming through. It came through. The spatial fold opened like a wound in space that was also, somehow, a door. Luminous and unstable and exactly large enough for purpose, holding at the nebula's edge with the particular beautiful precariousness of things that exist because someone did the math right and then worked very hard. The Colonial fleet went in groups, sequenced to Kim and Starbuck's schedule, FDL drives firing in the staggered cadence Torres had calculated. Civilian transports first. Then the military escorts. Then Galactica herself, last as always, Adama's ship covering the retreat of his people the way it always had. Adama's voice came over the channel in the final 30 seconds before Galactica entered the fold. Captain Janeway. Admiral. A pause that carried things that didn't need words. Live long and prosper, he said, and she could hear in the careful way he said it that he had learned the phrase specifically for this moment, which was the kind of thing William Adama did. So say we all, she said, and she meant it. Galactica went through. The fold closed. The space where 50,000 people had been was empty in the particular way that space is empty when something that mattered was there and isn't anymore. Not absence, exactly, but presence of a different kind, the kind that stays. Janeway stood on her bridge for a moment in the quiet. Then she said, Mr. Paris. Set a course for home. Tom Paris, who had been waiting for those words with the patience of someone who had learned that they always came eventually, laid in the heading without a word. Voyager moved. The Delta Quadrant kept no record of what had happened there. No monument marked the coordinates where a subspace corridor had torn open and deposited 50,000 survivors into a universe that had no name for them. No Federation database entry existed for the 12 colonies, for Galactica, for the war that had followed humanity across the stars until it fell through a crack in reality and found, and probably, someone willing to stand between it and the thing chasing it. The sensors recorded the residual energy signatures. The logs documented the engagement. But the meaning of it, the weight of 4 days in which 2 groups of lost people had recognized something essential in each other, that lived only in the people who had been present for it. Janeway filed her official report, and then sat alone in her ready room for a long time, looking at the stars. 7 of 9 kept the 23.7% resonance data in an active file rather than archiving it, which was, for 7, a statement of intent. The doctor added 3 new entries to his medical database under a classification he created himself: consciousness and identity in non-standard biological substrates. He considered the title for a while. Then he kept it. Chukate wrote in his personal log that he had met a man who carried his people's survival the way some people carry grief, not as a burden that diminished him, but as a weight that had become so much a part of his posture that removing it would leave him unrecognizable to himself. He did not name Adama. He didn't need to. Somewhere in another universe, Galactica jumped toward an uncertain coordinate and kept going. Both ships still had a long way home. Both crews knew how. Live long and prosper. Hit the subscribe button for more interesting stories. Thank you for watching.